Curbing global carbon dioxide emissions is a key element of climate change policy. Because emissions create the same negative externalities regardless of where they originate, the optimal policy is to impose a uniform tax in all countries and all industries equal to the global social cost of CO2, usually estimated to be around $40 per ton. In practice, actual climate policy departs sharply from this optimum. Regulations exist in only a patchwork of countries, differ substantially in different places, and generally price carbon at less than $10 per ton. To what extent do countries' trade policies help fill these gaps in climate change regulation? If tariffs are higher for dirty industries than for clean ones, this would constitute an implicit tax on carbon. Thus, this paper starts with a simple empirical question. Do tariffs tend to be higher on dirty industries? Answering this question requires tariff data for individual goods, along with information on the CO2 emissions, both direct and indirect, involved in the production of those goods. Consider the process of producing a car. The emissions involved include not only the fossil fuels burned by the factory that produces the car, but also those burned to produce the steel and rubber used in assembling the car, and to transport those intermediate inputs to the manufacturing plant. These are the sources of indirect emissions. To account for both direct and indirect emissions, the author uses global input-output tables, which track the dollars of output from one industry that are required to produce a dollar of output in another industry. These data are extensive, covering 163 industries across 48 countries, and trace out international production chains. A single entry might show the amount of Chinese steel required to produce a US car. Combining this information with data on emissions at the country-by-industry level, for example, the emissions rates of the Chinese steel industry and the US auto industry, allows the author to track the total emissions embodied in the full production chain of a given product. So, what does he find? Recall that optimal climate policy would dictate tariffs of $40 per ton of carbon. In other words, dirtier industries, which produce higher emissions, should pay higher tariffs. What the data actually reveal, however, is a negative relationship between tariffs and carbon intensity. Tariffs tend to be lower on industries with higher CO2 emissions. This is true globally, as well as in the US, and holds for both tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade, such as price controls and quality regulations. Far from imposing a tax of $40 per ton, global trade policy provides an implicit subsidy to carbon emissions of between $85 to $120 per ton of CO2. Note that this negative relationship between tariffs and carbon intensity, which the author dubs the environmental bias of trade policy, is not driven by an anomalous year or country. It appears consistently in most years, as shown here for the US from 1989 to 2017, and in most countries, as shown here using data from 2007. So, why are countries implicitly subsidizing dirty industries via their trade policy? The evidence suggests this is unlikely to be a deliberate choice. The implicit subsidy is high, or in other words, the implicit tax is most negative, in some countries that tend to have strict environmental policies, such as Norway, while being lower in other countries that don't, such as China and India. Instead, it's possible that there are forces that determine trade policy that just happen to be correlated with CO2 intensity. In other words, the environmental bias of trade policy may arise as an unintended consequence of another factor. To investigate this possibility, the author considers 20 industry-level factors that have been suggested by previous research as determinants of trade policy. And he finds that only one stands out as driving a large part of the relationship between tariffs and CO2 intensity: an industry's location in global value chains, also known as its upstreamness. Imagine laying out the production process for our car in a line starting from raw materials, such as iron ore, taken from the ground, turned into steel, and ultimately resulting in a finished product that is assembled and sold to consumers. Upstream industries are ones that lie farther away from final consumers, while downstream ones lie closer to them. The results show that upstream industries are not only more CO2 intensive, precisely because they take raw materials and transform them, they also have lower tariffs. From a political economy perspective, this pattern makes sense, as firms, who tend to be better organized than consumers, lobby for low tariffs on their inputs, but high tariffs on their outputs. A consequence of these dynamics is that tariffs are systematically lower on dirty industries, giving rise to the environmental bias of trade policy. How significant is this bias? The results suggest that the global implicit subsidy to CO2 emissions totals $550 to $800 billion per year. To put that number in perspective, the sum total of global direct subsidies to fossil fuels was $530 billion in 2007. Moreover, the author estimates that if we were to eliminate the tariff differentials between clean and dirty industries, global real income would remain unchanged, or even slightly increase, while global emissions would fall by an amount equivalent to the effects of two of the world's largest actual or proposed climate change policies: the EU emissions trading system and the US Waxman-Markey bill. Thus, while potentially inadvertent and even unbeknownst to policymakers, the environmental bias of trade policy is large and contributes to climate change. To read more on this topic, you can check out the full paper and its references to other related research. These include many papers on trade and the environment, political economy and the environment, and also research on tariff escalation, which is the phenomenon that more processed goods face higher tariffs.